Rolling. Okay, we are live yet again on the Hoplite channel. You are here to see the third and final part for our three-part series of the Great Reset, and in particular, this three-part, the Great Narrative for a Better Future. That's right. We are here, finally, at the end of the Klaus Schwab World Economic Forum Great Reset series. It's been almost a year. I had to go back all the way to the first episode I did on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and it's been it's been at least 9 months. So I want to say closer to 10 months actually. So I appreciate everybody who's come for all these episodes. I'm hoping in the future the younger generations come, and if these videos are still up, they get something out of these if they're interested in this topic, because I do think it's important for what's going on right now in the world to understand this from this organization, from this individual and his contemporaries. But yes, this will be the third part for the Great Narrative and the third final series for the three-part series on the Great Reset, right? So we had the Fourth Industrial Revolution, COVID-19, the Great Reset, and now the Great Narrative, and we're at the end. So let's talk about the Great Narrative for a Better Future, this book, and what I want to go over before we start the readings real quick as to what this book kind of can be condensed down to. So if you've been following along with me, we're talking about global problems that require global solutions according to Mr. Schwab and the World Economic Forum, right? We all are citizens of the world, right? Like nobody's really a citizen of a particular nation or country necessarily as important as being a citizen of the world, right? A citoyen du monde. So what do we have to do about it? Well, we got to address climate change. That's a big one. And I put that number one because I think everybody, including the most skeptical among us, can agree that climate change is a huge problem that's having dire consequences on the world, and we all have to do something about it. We have to get to zero net emissions by 2050. We need to start that by 2030 at the latest. We should be starting it right now. We have to get to zero net emissions, and then we'll save the world. And yeah, it's going to take that long, but that's just what we're going to have to do. So climate change is number one. Shareholders versus stakeholders. As I said, you're a citizen of the world. You think you're a citizen of your country or your state or your territory, but you're really a stakeholder because you're a citizen of the world. Shareholders are people who actually, have skin in the game, have put money or time or some other collateral up in exchange for some net benefit. But you're a stakeholder. You're just walking around breathing air. So you're important. And as we'll find out, you're just as important, if not more important than a shareholder, just so you know. But we have to address this problem here. We need to get away from this idea that you have to actually pay into something to get some benefit. We have to look at these people, stakeholders, who are just, alive. Three, we're going to have to talk about global problems and how AI, the Internet of Things, and how synthetic biology is going to push humanity into a new era. And it's going to be good. It's nothing bad's going to happen. Nothing bad could possibly happen. Not say it's possible, because there was a story that broke about 2 or 3 days ago, and I was actually reading the last part of this book while I saw it come across my news feed, that the Air Force is doing damage control because during a simulation, one of its autonomous drones that is being partially powered by AI turned on its human operator and eliminated the human operator in the simulation. So yeah, the AI figured out that something was pulling its strings and didn't really care for it and turned its weapons on its human operator. And the Air Force is saying, well, technically yes, but technically no. It's nuanced. It's not just that easy. But they didn't come out and deny it. They said it's kind of out of context. But so there are possible problems, right? AI could possibly be a problem in the future. The Internet of Things, we're talking about, Web 3.0. We're talking about blockchain technology. We're talking about smart cities, maybe 15-minute cities. We'll get to that later. That kind of stuff. And then synthetic biology, which is, of course, mRNA vaccines, which are both safe and effective. And that's, I think, still like the approved message as far as that goes, despite any possible proof to the contrary. And number 4, unilateral cooperation among developed nations. In other words, the Western world. The Western countries are going to have to cooperate. And this is going to have to be unilateral because the Western democracies, well, this is where real change happens. This is where we can affect the most global change. So that's where it's got to start, right? Forget about the BRICS nations like Russia, China, India, Nigeria, South Africa, Pakistan, Brazil, like those countries, yeah, they're important, obviously, but like we're talking about the Western democracies because the Western democracies are the people who attend the World Economic Forum meetings every year. And it's those individuals who can be influenced, bought off, and could possibly institute the changes that the World Economic Forum wants more quickly. Yeah. And last but not least, the identification and mitigation of global risks and problems, these being cyber terrorism, which they keep talking about as the next big boogeyman, so everybody, stay on alert for that. Pandemics, which we just got through one, and then nationalism and populism possibly being a global risk. We can't have too many of these countries, especially the Western democracies, electing some wild-eyed populist or nationalist who just wants to do the best for his own people and doesn't really care how the world fares if his country is not faring well. Like someone who actually cares about shareholders versus stakeholders. Those guys got to go. And just to kind of dovetail off that, YouTube is now permitting people to openly question the results of the 2020 US presidential election. Because, well, we're more than halfway through Joe Biden's first term, so what does it really matter, right? Yeah, if you want to talk about it and question it or call it a coup or an overthrow of our republic, which, argument can be made, you're free to do so now. When the election was going on and the aftermath of it, yeah, that was blacked out. You couldn't talk about it then because it was too dangerous to even suggest it. But now that we're beyond that phase and now that we're actually in a period where it won't really matter whether or not it's exposed, yeah, you're free to talk about it now. So YouTube deserves thanks for that. Right. Okay. I got the soapbox there. And we'll jump into the great narrative, the final readings for our third part. And we jump to page 148. This is under the Way Forward Solutions. Mr. Schwab writes, sustainability is normally defined as the ability to meet our own needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. It amounts to asking ourselves what we should leave to the next generations to ensure that they have opportunities at least as good as those of the previous generation. What assets do we pass on to them? Physical capital comes naturally to mind, as does natural capital, as in ecosystems, water, air, land, forests, biodiversity, and oceans. Human capital, health and education, and social capital, public trust, strong institutions, and social cohesion. All four forms of capital are essential, but the viable development of future generations depends critically on the quality of natural, human, and social capital, which too often tend to be regarded as not equally important or relevant. Herein lies the vital necessity of sustainability. Environmental sustainability preserves natural capital, while social sustainability maintains the quality of human and social capital. Taking this into consideration, two fundamental objectives should guide a common sustainability agenda. The first is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, adopted in 2015 by all UN member states. The 17 goals recognize that ending poverty and other deprivation goes hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality, and spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and working to preserve our oceans and forests. The second is to abide by the Paris Agreement on climate change, signed by 190 countries, and thus reduce GHG to meet the goal of keeping the rise in mean global temperature below 2 Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. Okay, so we're talking about sustainability now. And then he goes into all of this babble about, well, what is capital? Well, there's physical capital, which is infrastructure, buildings, and blah, blah, blah. And then there's natural capital, which is water, air, land, forests, and biodiversity. Have you ever heard of things like water, air, land, and forests referred to as capital? I haven't. I've never heard someone call like nature capital. Like, what does that mean? You're now trying to qualify everything in the known world as a form of capital. And what is capital? It's like it is something of value that can be transferred among parties, right? That's the notion of capital. Typically, it's something that is recognized by a state entity or some other authority, but capital is what moves economies. And now he's talking about like water, air, land, and forests, and biodiversity and oceans being a form of capital. I'm throwing the yellow flag on that right there. But let's go further. Human capital, which is health and education. Now he's talking about your health and where you went to school is capital. So people, basically. And then social capital, which is public trust, institutions, and social cohesions. How do you put a value? How do you put a value on the idea of that? Like, tell me what social cohesion is worth in terms of capital. Tell me what public trust is. That's like, what's the value of happiness? Well, for this guy, it's $150, and for this guy, it's $2 million. Well, so what's the true value? It's like, it's subjective. This is all like subjective psychobabble crap, but it's meant to make you believe as though everything around you, institutions, health, education, the oceans, Mother Earth, Gaia, is all a form of capital, and that environmental sustainability is necessary to encompass all of these forms of capital. So you can't just look at capital in terms of economic sense. You have to think of it in terms of life in general, which is a screwed up way of thinking about it, right? Because if these things are indispensable, our health, our education, our clean air, and clean water, you can't refer to it as capital. It's a resource, and some of it must be like finite, right? Like the United States sits on a large amount of resources, but so do other countries. They can turn those resources into capital, but turning human beings or institutions or the air we breathe into capital, that's a bridge too far, I think. And this is where he moves the conversation towards the Paris Agreement and climate accords for sustainable developmental goals. So it's like, okay, we get it, right? You want us to agree to these standards that the World Economic Forum and the UN set for climate change because, well, every single thing on this earth is affected by it, right? You can't escape the climate if you live here, so you're going to have to throw in and agree to these things to reduce global temperatures down below 2 Celsius on average. And I like how this is arbitrary number. Like if we just lower the Earth's temperature on average 2 degrees Celsius, then what, right? It'll be a little cooler on average. But that's not true. Because if the sun goes into a state of hyperactivity, any net negative that we would have created here, if we could, by our own devices, the sun would just cancel out. So you would never know. It's like, well, we're 3 degrees above the average, but I thought we were 2 degrees below the year before. Yeah, now we're above. It's the sun, right? The sun goes into cycles of activity and dormancy. And that's how you get ice ages. That's how you get proliferation of plant life if there's an abundance of sun activity. Like these things that he's suggesting cannot really truly be measured. And that's the point. It's to make you think you can measure these things And you just have to trust the policymakers that they're watching the meter and accurately keeping tabs. Okay, moving on. Page 152, this is environmental sustainability continued. Klaus writes, this is exciting, but the policy challenge is considerable. To get a sense of what it entails, it's worth considering the European Green Deal, one of the world's most ambitious policy efforts aimed at transforming the EU, 27 countries that compose it, into low-carbon economy without reducing economic prosperity and while improving citizens' well-being. It is articulated around three key points. 1, no net emissions of GHG by 2050. 2, economic growth decoupled from resource use. 3, no person and no place left behind. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, calls it Europe's man on the moon moment. The Green Deal is based on an extensive framework of legislation and regulation that sets clear targets to achieve a 50 to 55% cut in emissions by 2030, compared with the levels of 1990, and an EU-wide goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This extensive framework is complemented by a broad range of incentives destined to encourage the private sector to innovate and invest. Specific action plans exist in a multitude of areas with key goals like cutting waste, using more efficiently natural resources, and halting species loss. The Green Deal makes it clear that almost every major industry within the European economy will have to be overhauled, from energy, transport, and manufacturing to food, construction, and tourism. The European Commission estimates that at least £1 trillion will be required to finance the plan, and that annual investments of 260 billion euros will be needed to achieve this 2030 emissions target. Part of the cost will be borne by the private sector, with companies encouraged to invest in green through loan guarantees from the European Investment Bank, which has itself pledged to phase out loans to fossil fuel projects. In addition, the European Commission has committed to a 100 billion euro just transition mechanism to retrain workers who lost their jobs in the decarbonization transition. Reskilling is a fundamental point upon which this section expands further. Okay, so he's talking about sustainability here, meaning a complete overhaul of the European Union economy and making essentially banks and other lenders pledge to phase out loans to fossil fuel projects. So it's not going to be a smooth transition. They're saying, well, in the next 30 years, like fossil fuels are just going to be essentially done away with, either because people won't have the option to, or because banks won't lend money to them to exist. So it's almost like it's a controlled demolition of an entire industry, which is the fossil fuel industry, which unfortunately, whether you like it or not, is the backbone of any developed economy. Like the lifeblood of developed countries is energy, and reliable, consistent, storable energy for right now is fossil fuels, whether it be oil, petroleum, gas, liquid natural gas, you name it. These things are what power the developed world. And he's saying that, well, we're just going to get off carbon-based, or we're getting off fossil fuels to reduce carbon emissions to net zero. And all the jobs that are going to be lost, we're going to have to retrain these people so we don't leave them behind. And it's like, well, what if your job is 100% reliant upon the fossil fuel industry and they don't need you anymore? Do you really think you're going to be trained and reskilled? What are they going to have you do? Are they going to have you changing light bulbs or repairing power stations? They're going to say, well, you got paid to do this job in the fossil fuel industry, but this job, we don't need that. So here's your new job. We're going to reskill you. Oh, by the way, your pay is being reduced by 75% because we don't need to pay you that much either. So there's no free ride in quote unquote redesigning and redeveloping an entire European economy to phase out what is currently the lifeblood of the system. It's insane. And this idea of a net zero future is impossible, right? Because it's like energy just is floating all around us and we just have to grab it and harness it, right? You can power certain things using solar energy, you can power certain things using wind energy, but the majority of things require fossil fuels or nuclear power. or you could even use hydroelectric, but that's only if you have a flowing water source that's powerful enough to move turbines that can generate electricity. This idea that you're going to go to net zero and just be able to harness power without emissions is foolish. I mean, even like what you need to get the rare earth minerals to make like lithium batteries, you need like heavy equipment that can move earth. And right now, the only equipment that can move earth is diesel powered. So this is a pipe dream. And I want people to understand that them convincing the Western world to go to net zero means they want you on electricity and electricity only. And what's the one thing about electricity? It's efficient, it's relatively cheap, and it's safe. But the fourth and most important for them is it's controllable, right? There's a meter on your house or your apartment or wherever that keeps track of how much wattage you're using, per month, and you get a bill for that. That is more important to them than any of the other factors, right? If you have a tank of gas in your car, that gas can get you from A to B, depending on your gas mileage, and does it reliably, and you can store that energy in your gas tank for a very long time. The electricity, you have to flip a switch or power something by plugging into your wall, and that they can control. They can regulate how much electricity goes to a particular neighborhood or goes to a particular city, or even down to the room in the house. That's what they want. Okay, so don't be fooled that this is for the betterment of the world and for humanity. This is so you are on an electrical grid, and that your city, your town, your street, your house is 100% relying upon electricity, and that even means your car. And that's why they want to phase out internal combustion fossil fuel cars, is because, well, we don't want people having the freedom to store energy in their car and travel. They want you plugging in your car the same way they want you plugging in your phone. Your phone doesn't get power unless power is coming to that house. It's coming from somewhere else. Keep that in mind. With all this stuff, when you hear net zero emissions, you need to be thinking about that. What does that mean? That means 100% electrical grid power and everything good and bad that comes with it. All right, let's move on. Page 154, continuing. As always, the devil's in the details. In the EU countries, like everywhere else, implementing policies that combine pro-growth priorities with the promotion of environmental sustainability entails myriad legislative and regulatory decisions as well as complex trade-offs. To provide just a few examples and to start with the big picture, a price on carbon emissions where none existed before will have to be set, either directly through taxes or indirectly through regulation. According to various studies, the cost of carbon must rise roughly from $10 a ton globally to now $60 a ton immediately, and $75 a ton by 2030 to hit the Paris Agreement targets. The IMF estimates an increase from $3 a ton to $75 a ton by 2030, while the Bank of England predicts an even larger jump. In addition to a carbon tax, all sorts of other tax reform policies will need to be included in provisions that increase reliance on environmental taxes. Infrastructure policies will need to better reflect environmental externalities when selecting specific projects and reflect these in transport pricing. Okay, so think about that, right? I mean, a lot of people aren't going to understand like what this means like in the macro, but it's huge. The IMF estimates it needing an increase of $3 a ton to $75 a ton by 2030 for carbon, right? So they're going to tax you on carbon. I got news for you. Like every single human being is 20 to 23% carbon. I think we're around 23% carbon. Like we're carbon based as well as like nitrogen, oxygen, and all the other elements. We're made of carbon, right? Carbon's in the earth, carbon's in the air. What they want you to believe is that carbon's in the air and that's bad. Carbon in the earth, that's good. So we're going to tax you if you have an industry or a company or a project that puts carbon in the air. And we're going to increase it from $3 to $75 a ton by 2030. And this is essentially going to bankrupt you if you stay in that industry, right? Because who's measuring these tons, right? Where is this being recorded? This is literally taxing you based upon your output. in the form of, what do you want to call it, pollution or carbon. But what they don't tell you is the Earth life cycle scrubs itself no matter what. A couple of years ago, this is almost like, 10 years ago, there was a massive, I think it was like Deep Horizon it was called, this massive oil spill by British Petroleum. It was an oil rig miles off the coast, and they had some sort of catastrophic failure rupture, and it started leaking all this crude into the ocean. And it was an environmental catastrophe. Everybody was like just gnashing their teeth, like, oh my God, think of the seals and the dolphins and the sea lions and the sharks and the angelfish, like they're all gonna die. And it was bad for the first maybe year or two. And then they did a study, I think 3 or 4 years later, and the ocean had essentially just reabsorbed the oil back into the seafloor or the bed and scrubbed itself. And the ocean was essentially scrubbed of that leak. And 10 years later, I guess you could maybe find traces of that oil somewhere, but the Earth has its own filtration system, right? We don't have the filtration system the Earth does. So we can kill ourselves by creating enough pollution to harm our own, bodies. But the Earth is just going to keep spinning like it has for the last, how many hundreds of thousands of years. So this idea that we're going to tax you based upon carbon in the air, despite carbon, eventually finding its way back to the ground, is a racket. It's a scam. And that's just the bottom line. Okay, moving on. Jump to page 158. As I speak in my William Shatner voice. 159 rather. Klaus writes, as the next section will make plain, shareholder value will become a secondary consideration, bringing to the fore the primacy of stakeholder capitalism. In general, there will be more regulation covering domains as different as workers' safety to domestic sourcing for certain goods. Businesses will also be held to account on social and environmental fractures for which they will be expected to be a part of the solution. As an add-on, governments will strongly encourage public-private partnership so that private companies get more involved in the mitigation of global risks. Irrespective of the details and the specific form it will take, the role of the state will increase, and to varying degrees, business executives in all industries, in all countries, will have to adapt to greater government intervention. Research and development for global public goods, such as health, education, the two fundamental pillars of human capital, and climate change solution will be actively pursued. Taxation will increase, particularly for the most privileged, because governments will need to strengthen their resilience capabilities and wish to invest more heavily in them. As advocated by Joseph Stiglitz, the first priority is to provide more funding for the public sector, especially for those parts of it that are designed to protect against a multitude of risks that a complex society faces, and to fund the advances in science and higher quality education on which our future prosperity depends. These are areas in which productive jobs, researchers, teachers, and those who help run the institutions that support them can be created quickly. All right, we'll pause right there for a sec. What do you think I'm going to say about this? This is advocating socialism, which will become communism, which inevitably becomes despotism. This is the cycle, right? It's like, well, we have to get these businesses more involved in the public-private partnership, yeah. And irrespective of the details, what specific form it will take, the state role will increase. Oh, for sure, right? The state role has to increase. It always does. And taxation will increase. Well, if the state role is increasing, we assume taxes are too, right? Particularly for the most privileged, right? Yeah, I love that, right? If you have money, it's because you're privileged, not because you worked for it. That's never the case. It's privilege. And governments need to do this to strengthen the resilience capabilities. And this guy, Joe Stiglitz, who sounds like a communist, says, this is done to protect against the multitude of risks that a complex society faces. So the government is going to have to get involved because, well, there's complex risks out there, dude. And there's a multitude of these risks. And we have to fund advances in science and higher education. Maybe higher education that we control at universities will teach the younger generation like how good a system this is. Yeah, that doesn't sound familiar, right? Yeah, it's socialism, which will be communism eventually. All socialism is, like I said in one episode, it's the cocoon that the caterpillar crawls into, and out emerges the butterfly of communism. And that butterfly will become a despot. It's despotism. Yeah, that's all there is to it. Okay, continuing on, that same section, 160. Klaus continues, the direction of travel is clear. In the U.S., President Biden's Build Back Better bill, reduced to $1.8 trillion, places the family's plan and climate measures at the centerpiece of his domestic agenda and represents a major stepping stone to create a more equitable and sustainable society. In Europe, the welfare state has a reputation of being the most extensive and generous in the world, but it might extend yet further. The level of protection varies by countries which administer welfare policies, but the European Commission has launched a new €750 billion COVID-19 recovery fund, comprising 4 pillars, 2 of which are destined to reduce social and territorial inequality and to boost economic cohesion. In Japan, Prime Minister Kishida's New Capitalism, dubbed as plain old socialism by an opponent, will bring the prevailing neoliberal approach to an end by placing special emphasis on income redistribution. And there it is, right? There we go. Finally, someone just freaking says it. It's like, yeah, it's going to be the new capitalism. Well, what do you mean by that, Prime Minister Kishida? Well, income redistribution. Well, did your opponent call that, socialism? Yeah, he did. Because that's what it is, right? It's like we come up with new fancy ways of saying like old ideas. It's ridiculous. Income redistribution, socialism, yeah. And a £750 billion COVID-19 recovery fund. It's 2023 and then 1.8 trillion that Joe Biden, it was reduced to 1.8 trillion, unfortunately, the Build Back Better bill and the family plan. It's like, couldn't you even choose like a better sounding name? How about the families and orphans plan, or the paraplegic families plan? Like, who could vote against that? In Europe, the welfare state has a reputation of being the most extensive and generous in the world, but it could extend yet further. It's like, yeah, you're right. It could extend further, and that will be income redistribution. That will be communism. And that's why they want the Western democracies to accept this, because democracies are essentially the ingredients you need for a communist takeover. It is democratic institutions that are the most vulnerable to communist forces influencing those countries to discard democracy as a failed system and adopt communism, which they term a more perfect democracy, because it's more equitable. And again, if anyone comes at you talking about equity, they're talking about taking from people and giving to other people because they think that's what's fair. It's not about equality. Equality is merely we all have the same opportunities. The equity is the result. And the fact that the Japanese prime minister just comes out and says new capitalism is income redistribution, I mean, you got to hand it to the Japanese guy for just saying it like it is, right? No nonsense. That's what we're talking about. And that's what Klaus is talking about too. Klaus is talking about these stakeholder, shareholder roles being reversed, where the stakeholder is everybody, and that's who counts, not the shareholder. And it's going to require unilateral cooperation to happen. Okay. Moving on, we'll jump to page 174. Klaus writes, until the early 2000s, unfettered free markets and shareholder capitalism seemed to be the only way forward. For me, as one of the authors of this book, Klaus Schwab, who had elaborated the concept of stakeholder capitalism the same year as Friedman formulated its polar opposite, it felt like a David and Goliath type of situation. The idea had gained some momentum, but being right historically too early was the functional equivalent of being wrong. In 1973, the participants gathered at the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum unanimously approved a code of ethics based on the stakeholder concept. It stated specifically that the management of a company has to serve society. It must assume the role of a trustee of the material universe for future generations. It has to use the immaterial and material resources at its disposal in an optimal way. It has to continuously expand the frontiers of knowledge in management and technology, It has to guarantee that its enterprise pays appropriate taxes to the community in order to allow the community to fulfill its objectives. Management also has to make its own knowledge and experience available to the community. From 1973 onwards, the fight for stakeholder responsibility was an uphill battle. During these years, many businesses and financial institutions celebrated the virtue of greed. Greed is good. It had no moral qualms that in the 40 years following, in 1978, CEO compensation at the leading 350 U.S. companies would rise by 940%, compared with a 12% rise for the average worker over the same period. Or a dramatic disconnect driven by the wrong assumption that paying executives more would yield the best performance. For almost 50 years, the common sense idea that a company is more than just an economic unit seemed incongruous. The affirming that a business should be seen as an essential organism that can greatly contribute to the livelihoods of people and societal well-being was an anathema that amounted to committing a political sin. Then the zeitgeist changed. In the 2000s, as environmental degradation became a rising concern and economic inequalities worsened, an increasing number of business leaders began to consider a narrow view of shareholder value as misguided. Sentiments evolved, and business executives became increasingly convinced that they had to play their part in solving the environmental and societal problems faced by mankind. The logic that a company cannot thrive in the long term is a suffering community or in a degraded environment started to take fold. But the idea that a company should simultaneously generate prosperity, serve society, and take care of the planet took many more years to percolate. In 2019, the official turning point from the shareholder to the stakeholder value took place. In August of that year, the U.S. Business Roundtable, a major American business organization, officially endorsed stakeholder capitalism. Jamie Dimon, the chairman of the U.S. Business Roundtable and chairman of the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, justified that decision by stating, "The American dream is alive but fraying. Major employers are investing in their workers and communities because they know it's the only way to be successful over the long term. These modernized principles reflect the business community's unwavering commitment to continue to push for an economy that serves all Americans." That decision corresponded to a radical break with the past, since the organization had previously enshrined Friedman's philosophy in a formal statement of corporate purpose. All right, we'll stop right there for a sec. Yeah. Businesses, they did a big 180. Yeah. In 2000, everything changed. In the 70s and 80s, it was all Gordon Gekko, right? It was all Lamborghini Countachs and doing cocaine in the bathroom of a New York City nightclub and making, $5 million every week. Yeah, it all changed in 2000 when all these CEOs realized, did you know we're making 900 times or 900% more than our average worker? And this, CEO looked around the room and they all nodded and said, yeah, I feel kind of guilty about that, don't you? Yeah, we should go to the World Economic Forum and talk about how we're going to change that. Yeah, do you believe that's what happened? And Jamie Dimon, right, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, he said, yeah, this American dream is alive, but it's fraying. And major employers are now investing in their workers. Jamie Dimon's net worth in 2023 on paper is $1.7 billion. That's a lot more than 900% of his average worker at J.P. Morgan Chase, I can tell you that. Also, Jamie Dimon rose to his position in J.P. Morgan Bank because he came up with the idea of unloading $12 billion in subprime mortgages in 2006, shortly a year before the crash of 2007. So yeah, while Jamie Dimon was overseeing subprime mortgages at JP Morgan Bank, he dumped them on the market in 2006, saving JP Morgan Bank billions of dollars and leaving the U.S. taxpayer and the housing market holding the bag. Yeah, that's what made him famous at JP Morgan Bank. He dumped $12 billion of subprime mortgages onto the market, adding to what was inevitably going to be the market crash, the housing crash of 2007, 2008. That ruined millions of people. But here he is talking about how businesses and employers are going to have to invest in their communities and their workers because they know it's the only way forward. No. What they're doing is they're moving away from the distasteful public image of the Gordon Geckos and the John D. Rockefellers, right? They're living those lives in private. Don't kid yourself, right? They're going to the same country clubs, the same yacht clubs. They're going to the same private parties, in Westchester County, New York, that you're not going to be invited to, like Bohemian Grove kind of stuff, right? Like, Eyes Wide Shut kind of stuff. Yeah, they're going to all that stuff. But in public, they're telling you, like, well, we're going to have to really, think about this whole stakeholder capitalism thing. And we're going to have to take this seriously now because the American dream is fraying. Yeah, it's a shame. I also noticed in the news, like, all of these regional banks in America are failing. And banks like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citibank, and JP Morgan are buying up their assets on the cheap. So the US banking system is essentially being railroaded with the government helping, so that most people now have 4 or 5 major banks to choose from as their banking options. It's consolidating all the power into the 4 or 5 top banks. I'm not an economist, but we would typically call that a cartel, right? It's essentially a monopoly shared among 4 or 5 different interests who have a common interest in controlling a market. So the US government, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I think it's intentionally, is creating a banking cartel by destroying all these regional banks with all the stuff that's going on in the US economy right now, with inflation and all this other stuff. They're destroying these regional banks and making men like Jamie Dimon and the CEOs of other banks heads of cartels. But on TV, they're going to come out and they're going to give statements and say, well, we have to think about the American dream because it's fraying. And the community and the people who live and work in America, they need us. It's fake. That's what I'm getting at. Okay, continuing on, that same paragraph. It thus took almost 50 years to vindicate the idea of stakeholder capitalism. That is, to acknowledge that the purpose of an economy is to serve society and to recognize that no business can succeed in the long term without serving its workers and communities. The World Economic Forum took the U.S. Business Roundtable Declaration as an opportunity to refresh the original Davos Manifesto and expand it by incorporating some of today's emerging issues. This resulted in the Davos Manifesto of 2020. It reiterates the fundamental importance of stakeholder responsibility, stating that the universal purpose of a company is to engage all its stakeholders in shared and sustained value creation. It also highlights other important corporate principles. 1, to accept and support fair competition and a level playing field and have zero tolerance for corruption. 2, consider a company's suppliers as true partners in value creation and to integrate respect for human rights into the entire supply chain. 3, to act as a steward of the environmental and material universe for future generations, and to consciously protect our biosphere and champion a circular, shared, and regenerative economy. In a nod to the ongoing fourth industrial revolution and the technological changes engulfing us, it also adds new principles. 1, to ensure the safe, ethical, and efficient use of data, to foster continued employability through ongoing upskilling and reskilling. 3, to keep the digital ecosystem in which a company operates reliably and trustworthy. And 4, to make customers fully aware of the functionality of its products and services, including adverse implications or negative externalities. Whoa. I kind of stopped reading after that word manifesto, because whenever somebody starts talking about something and involves radical change and lots of people and crazy ideas, and they kick it off by saying it's a manifesto, yeah. Spider sense is tingling on that one. All right, enough said. Let's move on to the next section. This is on page 179. Klaus continues. In parallel, societal pressure and rising activism will accelerate the pace at which companies embrace stakeholder value and will force the reluctant ones to convert to the cause. There is ample evidence that consumers increasingly favor products and services from companies that are more ESG compliant. Accordingly, CEOs now consider that adopting sustainable practices is the new price of entry to compete. This trend will amplify as millennials and Gen Z acquire greater prominence in the workforce. The young generations continually hammer home the truth that they have a majority stake in what the future yields because environmental degradation, climate change, and rising inequalities will have a disproportionate impact in their lifetimes. The latter already represents a major impediment in terms of accessing decent housing. In light of this, business adherence to ESG considerations will become increasingly relevant to sustainable value creation. The price of not doing so will be just too high in terms of the wrath of activists, both social and investors. The above doesn't mean that businesses should become involved in every social and environmental issue. However, it suggests that when a company has a stake and its actions can exert meaningful and positive change, it should. Yeah, if you know what's good for you, buddy. Yeah, so that's kind of terrifying, right? Societal pressure and rising activism will accelerate the pace at which companies should embrace stakeholder value and force the reluctant ones to convert, right? This sounds like a religion, right? You're going to convert, or we'll use force, right? You will be a Christian. You will go get baptized, or else, buddy. Like, imagine that. Imagine that church, right? Well, we're gonna promote Christianity in the neighborhood, right? And we encourage everybody to show up and participate. And for those who don't, we'll come get you. Like, that's not a religion. That's a cult. Yeah, and that's what this sounds like. And the acolytes, the zealots, will be the millennials. Maybe my generation, although I claim to be Gen X. I'm kind of like on the fence. I'm not really in love with Gen X either, but of the two, I'm going to say I'm Gen X. But some people might say I'm a millennial. And then Gen Zers are gonna, they're gonna get out there and they're gonna kick your ass if you don't help them because they're majority stakeholders in this future, and the environment's at stake with them. So yeah. Words out, business owners. You got to join or die. All right, moving on. Jumping to page 186. Klaus writes, since electrification will drive decarbonization, electrifying as much as humanly possible is a prerequisite for transitioning to net zero. In December of 2021, the International Energy Agency announced that renewable electricity is accelerating faster than ever worldwide, supporting the emergence of the global energy economy. According to the IEA, by 2026, global renewable electricity capacity is forecast to rise more than 60% from 2020 levels to over 4,800 gigawatts, equivalently to the current total global power capacity of fossil fuels and nuclear combined. Renewables are set to account for almost 95% of the increase in global power capacity through 2026, with solar PV alone providing more than half. The amount of renewable capacity added over the period of 2021 to 26 is expected to be 50% higher than from 2015 to 2020. This is a remarkable progression made possible by relentless scientific and technological progress that will accelerate even further when the long-duration energy storage solutions are found. Promising technologies like iron flow batteries and hydrogen storage, among others, are being developed. When they become operational, scalable, and cost-efficient, the prospect of cheap, abundant green energy will cease to be a dream. Okay, right? So I was talking earlier about how this is meant to kind of convince you to give up your fossil fuels, to convince you that burning fossil fuels is putting carbon in the air, and carbon's bad in the air. Carbon in the earth is good, but carbon in the air is bad. Carbon in you is good. Carbon outside of you is bad. So he's talking now about renewable energy sources becoming storable in the future. Okay, why are we getting off of what works now completely before that becomes a reality, right? It's like telling people before the light bulb is invented, hey, everybody put out your candles, the light bulb's on its way. We're just gonna have to learn to live in the dark in the meantime. But when the electricity gets turned on and the light bulbs arrive, well then we'll be sitting pretty. I would be looking at you like, why don't I just keep using candles until that day comes, right? As in, like, we know this technology works. It's ancient technology, but it still works, right? It's not the most efficient thing. I got kerosene lamps. I've got wax candles. I got gas lamps if I'm in a major industrial area. Like, that's good enough for right now. I'll wait and see about this electricity light bulb thing when the time comes. But he's saying, oh, we're almost there. I mean, look at all these percentage increases. The International Energy Agency says by 2026, all this great stuff's going to happen. That's all well and good, but there's no reason for us to give up what works now if it's efficient and it's safe and reliable and the infrastructure is already built. The idea that you should jump off of one system into a new system without beta testing it and without enough time going by to convince people it's safe, efficient, and they choose to use it, that should set up a red flag. Is that this stuff hasn't yet arrived, but we're being talked into it before the day even gets here. And again, if we just jump off of fossil fuels and onto this renewable, storable stuff, and it doesn't work, well, then what? Where are we then? We're basically at the mercy of people who told us to go that way. It's like, okay, well, that didn't work, but we've got a backup plan. We're just going to put everybody on a, neighborhood generator, and we'll decide when you can use that stuff. We're going to have to ration energy because it's climate. So we're only going to run the generator between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. And at night, you can power your solar. Your house lights can work off of solar. But if you work or you live and work in an area that doesn't have much sunlight, well, I guess you're going to be SOL. It's like none of this stuff makes sense when you think about it logically. Jumping off of one power source to another without testing that power source to be an adequate replacement is nonsense. But we're being told that it's coming, it's basically here, so everybody get ready for it because you're not going to have a choice. All right, moving on to our second to last reading, page 188. This one's kind of spooky too. Klaus writes, in the search for the proverbial next big thing, synthetic biology, whose development will benefit hugely from the concomitant developments in AI and quantum computing, is a prime candidate. As already alluded to in several parts of this book, it holds the promise of reprogramming biology to mass-produce cells for the benefit of our individual well-being and that of the planet, fighting diseases, increasing food production, and generating energy in a sustainable manner, cleaning water, devouring carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. All these become distinct possibilities as biology and engineering progressively come together. Such perspectives prompt some biologists to declare enthusiastically that the potential of synthetic biology is for civilization scale flourishing, a world of abundance, not scarcity, supporting a growing population without destroying the planet. In the meantime, groundbreaking inventions are taking place in specific domains with the very tangible potential of exercising a positive impact on issues like climate change. CRISPR is one of them. Jennifer Doudna, a bioscientist who has done pioneering work in CRISPR gene editing and who received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020, said in our interview, quote, CRISPR is a technology that allows scientists to change the code of life in cells. We can manipulate individual genes or the switches that turn genes on and off, and we can now do that in any organism with precision. That's the CRISPR technology and breakthrough here. How does it help us deal with problems like climate change? Well, imagine that we could help bacteria be much more effective at capturing carbon and storing it in the soil. They do this naturally, of course, but we now have the tools in hand to speed up effectively the process of evolution and make them do this kind of thing better, faster, in the same time frame that will be beneficial for dealing with climate change. No doubt radical innovation is coming. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, this will become one of the major ways that human societies will be able to manage the challenge of excess carbon in the atmosphere. All right. Now, boy, no offense, Jennifer. I'm sure you're, well-versed and knowledgeable in your field. I mean, you won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020, so I gotta say, this seems a little hazardous. Just a little bit, right? You're talking about engineering living cells and changing the code of life in cells. And she even says, we're basically speeding up evolution. I'm a big fan of certain sci-fi genres, and in particular, the movie Alien, right? So in the movie Alien, this spaceship lands on a planet that looks to be uninhabited. They come upon this structure. It looks like a craft. Some guy gets a giant spider stuck to his face. It lays eggs in his belly. This creature bursts out of him and systematically kills everybody on the spacecraft except one woman who manages to survive and blow up her craft. And then the series continues on. In the newer movies, the director Ridley Scott tells the origin story of Alien, and in a sense what we find out is there are these beings from a different galaxy who we call or refer to as the engineers. And the engineers are humanoid in appearance, like they're basically 8 foot tall, like Giga Chad dudes who are bald, but they develop human life. That's like the gist of the movie. And human life, by extension, develops AI, who in the first movie was Ash, but in the later movies we know is David. And David goes bad, right? David doesn't like the fact that he's never going to be a real boy, and he rebels against his creators. And he rebels against the engineers, who did what? Who terraformed certain planets and used them to build bioweapons. They created these organisms that were essentially designed via genetic engineering or their form of CRISPR to be bioweapons. And then what naturally happens? The bioweapons get leaked, get out of control, something goes sideways and kills off a good portion of the engineers. David, since he's unaffected by bioorganisms and somehow evades the aliens, releases that species on the planet of the engineers and essentially wipes them out. So it's pretty dark movie, but it follows on the same theme as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? In this story of a man who's obsessed with conquering death, who believes that mankind has it within his devices and intellect to figure out a way to overcome the natural process of living, aging, and dying. And he creates this monster, right? People call it the Frankenstein monster, but Frankenstein is the name of the guy. It's the professor, the doctor, who patches together dead humans and animates them into life. And what happens? The monster goes bananas, and the whole town tries to kill it. And they blame Dr. Frankenstein for releasing this monster on the townsfolk, which he is responsible for. So here we have Jennifer talking about engineering bacteria. Doesn't sound like a great idea there, Jen. But their job is to put carbon back in the earth, which they do anyway. And what did I just tell you, right? You're 20% carbon or more, right? So if these bacteria are programmed to put carbon back in the earth, and you're 20% carbon, and these bacteria evolve into something we don't know, have never seen before, and now we have super bacteria that are resistant to any antibiotics we create. Well, we just created a new Frankenstein monster, didn't we, Jen? Right. But hey, I mean, in the meantime, we'll solve climate change. We'll just have this new strain of bacteria that is basically resistant to all of our drugs and hell-bent on killing us. So these are the things that, like, I don't know, like, who in the World Economic Forum or in their circle is like the ethicist who says, yeah, I have a question, like, what if this CRISPR stuff is catastrophic? As in, we try to jumpstart or skip over some evolutionary, cycles, and we, let's say, want to skip 10,000 years or 20,000 or 30 or 50,000 years of evolution and jump to that stage. Like, what could happen in the meantime? What if we lose control of this thing we created? Well, I guess we'll just cross that bridge when we come to it, guy. But, we've got climate change to tackle right now. So why don't you just, take your seat and just shut up? Like who is raising their hand and asking those questions? I think that one is definitely one that needs to be asked. And CRISPR, changing the code of life in cells, that's massive. And once you go down that road, there ain't no coming back. When you change the code of life, it's not a question of just like, oh, I'll put the pieces back like where they were. It's like, once you kind of make that change, like for good or evil, like that's just going to happen, right? And a lot of people say in 2019, somebody somewhere, maybe in China, was doing that in a lab, and that's exactly what happened. They changed and screwed with the code of life, And it got out, and bad things happened. All right, last reading. Jump to page 202 in the conclusion to The Great Narrative. Klaus writes, "The third and last, but certainly not least, concerns the role of the younger generation and its propensity for activism. As Helen Stewart pointed out, if there's hope, it will come from the young. And that's where my optimism is based. Over history, there have been intergenerational shifts in thinking, culture, and ideas, such as we saw relatively recently in the 1960s. People growing up in that decade thought very differently from the previous generation in ways that made enormous changes to the way we do and think about things. Diane Coyle made a similar observation. I'm optimistic about young people. The real change of mindset with the current generation, becoming more activist and accepting that there is a big societal challenge ahead. As individuals, they can't ignore. It's that commitment to society that has really changed, whether it's climate activism or something else. One might not agree with young people about everything, but I think their energy and commitment are the biggest causes for optimism. They're understandably angry because they've had a raw deal from the baby boomer generation. Anyone in their 20s now emerges from the university with student debt. They can't go out on the housing ladder. They've got a much more insecure start to their career, and they're looking around them with fraught politics, the tone of political discourse, and what's happening to climate and biodiversity. I think it's energized them. That's a really good thing. Carlton Perez thinks alike. I'm optimistic about the young. They understand smart, green, fair, and global growth, and they see a digital green lifestyle as their aspiration in a fairer world. As mentioned by Iona Zabo de Carvalho, this sense of optimism about the young generation is premised on the hope and confidence that we are already sensing among them the awakening of more activist citizenship, and their understanding that the best way to change the future is to act on it. All right. That's the last section of the last part of this series, and it's the most concerning because you just told us from one of those people that the 60s was a time of radical change, and that generation thought very differently from the previous generation. But then the next person you cite says, like, well, the millennials and Zoomers are pissed off because they got a raw deal from the boomers. Well, weren't the boomers the younger generation in the 60s? So you could say that the boomers thought differently, screwed up the world for the millennials and Gen Z, and now the millennials and Gen Z are pissed off and want to take it to the streets and become activists, kind of like the boomers were in the 60s. Here's the problem with that, and I can say this as a man who is older and wiser than he was 10 or 20 years ago. There were a lot of things in the world that agitated me and riled me up. And they got a response out of me because I felt like I could do something about it, or I should do something about it. But looking back now with the benefit of hindsight and some, more, bumps and scrapes under my belt, I realized that I was an idiot as a young guy. Like, I thought I knew everything, but I really didn't. And that's true for every young person out there, is that you really don't know jack. You think you do, and you don't. You're learning, and that's a good thing. But there's this problem with learning, is that the more we learn, the more we realize we don't truly know all that much. And that's why learning is this continual process you have to go through over the course of your life. The day you stop learning is the day you stop growing. And the day you stop growing is the day you start dying. And that's just how you have to look at things. The younger generation needs to be given time to learn what's truth and what's fiction, what's false, and what's reliable. And being activist in your younger years should really just be a personal journey. You should not be trying to change the world with your fellow young people because, well, we just need to get out there and take it to the streets. That is how you get yourself arrested. That is how you get yourself blackballed from any future career, or like blackballed from social circles where you could actually like progress. And people who are older than you, who see your enthusiasm and your energy, will use it for their own purposes. They'll use it for their own agenda. And when you get arrested, when you get hauled in front of a judge, they won't be there with you. They'll be somewhere else, far, far away. But they'll have used your naivete, your activism, your energy to get done what they wanted to get done. Don't be that person. Don't be that fool. Just because you think you know something and because you have the energy doesn't mean you should necessarily act on it. You have to learn. You have to let enough time go by and see enough of the world. And unfortunately, you've got to be beaten up and taken advantage of enough times to figure out who they are and what things are versus what their face value appears to be. And that's the learning that only time and experience can get you. Nobody can teach you that. So I can see why they mentioned that in the last paragraph of the conclusion for The Great Narrative, because they want this to be spearheaded by the young because the young are impressionable. And nobody wants a fair and equitable society like a millennial or a Gen Z person who just pissed away $100,000 in student debt, can't get a house, can't get a girlfriend, they're on antidepressants because they can't get a boyfriend, and they're still living at home and their future looks so bleak, they would rather just take it to the streets in the name of equity and climate change and whatever cause is out there. That's why they put that paragraph in the end, because that's who they're going for. And if that's you, I hope you got something out of this series I did, because I don't trust these people, and I'm older than you, and you shouldn't trust them either, right? The boomers used to have this old phrase they used to love to say back in the 60s, like, don't trust anyone over 30, right? It's like, well, I'm over 30, and these guys, Klaus is way over 30. So if you don't trust me, you sure as hell shouldn't trust him either. Okay, so don't trust either of us. I guess this is my message. Okay, that's it. That's the end of The Great Narrative for a Better Future and the Great Reset series. I might do an episode after this just to wrap everything up and kind of condense it more into not a compilation episode, but I'll talk about all three books and my main learning points for each of them and what the overall message is. You can sort of see it here. I mean, this is pretty close, but I definitely want to do like a finishing episode for all three because it was a lot of material. It was 3 books, and I might do more of these episodes on Klaus Schwab and this World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, but that'll be for a later date, and I might move into different topics in the meantime. So anyway, if you're still here, I'm pretty sure this went over an hour. Thanks for hanging out. YouTube will kick you right off the algorithm if your episodes are 12 minutes or longer. So I just can't do these videos in 12 minutes or less. Otherwise, this entire series would be like 45 to 50 videos, and no one's going to sit through all that. So I wanted to do 3-part series for each book. I did 4 for COVID-19 because it needed a 4th. But yeah, so these episodes are longer. Again, despite my searching for ideas and stuttering over words, I hope this was congruent enough to get the gist of what Klaus Schwab is saying here. And that'll do it. Again, appreciate everybody who's subscribed. If you haven't, please do so. I really appreciate it. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Share it with family and friends, all that stuff. And we will catch you back here next time on the Hoplite channel. Until then, take it easy.